Welcome to Chapter 10 video presentation. This chapter comprises a part, more specifically part 1, of a broader topic of conducting procurements. This video presentation, just like all video presentations in this course, are based on the book by Quinton Fleming titled Project Procurement Management, Contracting, Subcontracting, and Teaming. Those are the learning objectives for this video presentation. After completing Chapter 10, you should be able to explain why formal solicitation processes are on the decline. It is something that is related to the rise of the use of the internet in buying and selling things or services that were previously purchased through a formal solicitation process. You should also be able to discuss some of the problems in using supplier databases and how organizations deal with these problems. You should also be able to explain how and why pre-bid conferences are conducted. Finally, you should be able to compare and contrast sole source and single source procurements. So let's start with a general discussion on the solicitation process. Solicitation is a generic term that includes invitation for bids, request for proposals, request for quotations, or any other methods of soliciting prices from vendors and subcontractors. So depending on the nature of the product or service requested, the names of those documents may be different, or the names of those specific processes may be different. The main purpose of solicitation is to obtain viable responses from prospective sellers sufficient to satisfy the project list of buy items. The solicitation process starts with the definition of what is to be purchased, taking the form of a formal document. Again, depending on the nature of the procurement, this document can be called request for proposal, and this is probably the most common name, or request for a quote, or request for information, and there are many other variations of the name for this document. So once again, this process starts with the definition of what is to be purchased, taking the form of a formal document, and then this document is sent to the prospective seller. So those are the two starting points of the solicitation process. Now, another important goal of the solicitation process that is probably something that is happens before viable responses are received is to ensure fairness. In other words, to ensure that all sellers, all prospective vendors are treated fairly, because this fairness is something that can ensure fair competition, and as a result of that fair competition, the buyer, the company, is more likely to get a good price-quality combination from prospective vendors. So all in all, this chapter is devoted to the processes between two time points. The time when RFPs or other solicitation documents, again depending on the nature of procurements, are sent, and point number 2, when responses from vendors are received. So what are the things that are happening between those 2 points? So this is what this chapter is largely about. Now, today, internet solicitations are on the rise, and formal advertising and processing or formal solicitation is on the decline. Why is that? Well, the thing is, internet, as you probably all well know, is replacing some of the benefits behind a formal solicitation process. So, one of the reasons to have a formal solicitation process is to advertise a particular contract broadly, so that a number of vendors or sellers can hear about it and respond. And this is something that ensures adequate competition that will ultimately result a good price quality combination for the buyer. Well, nowadays you don't need to advertise potential procurements in order to find numerous vendors that can potentially bid on this procurement contract. All it takes nowadays is to do a quick search in Google or any other search engine, and you will find all those vendors, and you can contact them directly. Also, apart from Google, there are a number of specialized databases that contain information about various companies in various industries. So all those things can be accomplished with much less time and cost than the formal solicitation process seems to offer. So yeah, internet is replacing, is quickly making some of the benefits of the formal solicitation process a bit more questionable and I guess outdated. But still, majority of complex procurements are still subject to formal solicitation process. They cannot be based on a simple Google search in order to identify a potential list of viable vendors, and then after identifying this list, you just go ahead and start working with them. So majority of complex procurements, they're still formal. They're still based on a formal solicitation process. This seems to be especially true for government procurements. Government bodies, they tend to follow formal solicitation process as well, even if it's something that is not very complex. So the formal solicitation process is still quite relevant and is still widely used, especially when it comes to the government. Now, a lot of mature supply chain oriented organizations have a database of previously approved sellers. So this is something that in a way can make the job of soliciting information from vendors easier, because you know in the first place what vendors you can potentially contact about a buy item that you need for your project. Now, oftentimes those databases contain not only seller information, let's say contact information and what those sellers do, but also a rating system based on the seller's past performance. And the rating system can be based on such things as on-time deliveries, quality of parts, cooperation, flexibility, responsiveness, and so forth. Now, unfortunately, sometimes those databases are too large to be useful. Oftentimes, the information contained in those databases is also outdated. So oftentimes, buyers they don't work with those databases directly. Instead, to make things faster and simpler, they often rely on a few recommendations from the technical specialist to select a few viable vendors from that list or from that database, or even outside of this database. So typically, selecting a few viable vendors to participate to participate in bidding is sufficient to introduce a reasonable competition. But the problem with this informal approach that goes around this formal database of vendors is that if an organization decides to somehow reduce this list of sellers, either by ignoring them based on a face-to-face recommendation from a technical specialist, or in general by cleaning it up, then sellers tend to object because they may feel that there is some sort of their violation of some kind of agreement that they will be on that list and they will work with the company. So sometimes it creates introduces some negativity into the relationship between a company and the potential sellers or vendors that it cooperates with. Now, buyers often hold conferences on many procurements to answer questions in relation to an RFP document. So here we're talking about additional questions. Now, why do those additional questions arise? Well, most of the time, or quite often, RFPs are usually compiled in a hurry and they require additional clarifications. Now, during those conferences, sellers should have an equal opportunity to ask questions. You don't want to be in a situation where one seller somehow completely dominates the discussion and asks all the question. One way to do it is to collect questions from potential sellers prior to a conference, and then so that informative answers can be given to all sellers present during the conference based on the previously compiled list. And then after those main questions are answered, then additional questions can be taken from the conference participants to clarify something that was not clarified by that formal comprehensive response to the previously collected questions. Now, still, a lot of projects they involve limited competition, and those kind of exceptions, they typically fall into two categories: sole source procurement and single source procurement. So what is sole source procurement? Well, sometimes it is not possible to solicit proposals from more than one source in the first place. And the reason for that is that there is only one source for a given product. It could be that the product or service that you are trying to purchase for your project is supplied by the so-called natural or artificial monopoly, meaning that there's only one company supplying that. Often happens with raw materials where, let's say, you're operating in a particular state and there's only one coal mine in your county or in your state, and there may be other coal mines, but you feel that it will prohibitively increase the cost of the project because the transportation cost will be too high. So in that case, you may have no choice but to go with that sole source of your product or service that you need for your project. I think to some extent this happens in electronics, where there's only a handful of companies in Asia mining lithium, a critical component used in batteries that are again used in many electronic devices. So a lot of the times companies, they don't have much choice as to where they're gonna source that lithium. It only comes from a few sources, and giving you geographical limitations, you may only have one viable or sole source of procurement of this chemical. So whenever there is only one source of a product or service, and you decide to work with the source, this situation is called sole source procurement. Now, sometimes you work with one vendor, but for a different reason. It's not a natural monopoly. It's not a monopoly situation at all whatsoever. So this is how single source procurements work. There can be many suppliers that can provide a product, but for valid reason, the buyer decides to work with only one supplier. So it's an artificial situation where you decide to exclude other viable vendors from competition. No matter what the reason is, it has to be well documented, and it has to be well justified. There needs to be a solid reason for working with only single vendor as opposed to working with a variety of vendors. Oftentimes, the decision is based on seller reputation or long-term relationship with the seller. I think one classic example of that is IBM. For a number of years, many companies believe that you cannot go wrong with IBM, and acknowledging that IBM can be quite costly and maybe sometimes archaic and bureaucratic, not as innovative, not as responsive as they wish. A lot of companies think that you cannot go wrong with IBM. It's a company that has a solid reputation. It's been around for decades, so they go ahead and work with IBM or Microsoft or whatever that giant with a superb reputation is. But just to expand on this idea on solid reasons as to why a company may want to participate in a single source procurement, meaning to artificially exclude competition, there is a legislature called Competition and Contracting Act of 1984, and this act recognizes the following legitimate reasons for working with a single source. So sometimes only one source is available, so you have no choice. Sometimes urgency of the project requires limiting the list of sources, so you don't have time to evaluate proposals from many vendors. You just need to grab the vendor that fits you best, at least based on the initial impression, to save time. Sometimes an award to a single source must be made to keep a critical facility or source viable. So for example, let's say there's a struggling factory in your town that employs a lot of people, and you know that if this factory goes bankrupt, then the entire town will lose its employment because most of the people work at that factory. So in that case, the government body, let's say participating in a project, may have a solid reason for buying specifically from that factory. Sometimes there is an agreement with the foreign government that says that this chemical or this natural resource will be supplied by this company. It's something that is related to high-level politics, geopolitical interest or something like that. Sometimes a particular source or method is required by statute. So, for example, there's some kind of policy that says we only work with, let's say U.S. car manufacturers when it comes to buying cars or any other transportation products. Again, this can be done for political reason or for pragmatic reasons. For example, there may be a statute that says we only buy Microsoft products because our existing infrastructure is compatible with Microsoft products. So something that is required by a deeper organizational consideration or policy. Sometimes sources are artificially limited to prevent information leakage in procurements related to national security. So in that case, there will be no competition. Let's say a government branch will sign an NDA, non-disclosure agreement, with a particular trusted seller, and they will work with them directly to minimize the chances of the information about this project being leaked to the general public. Or overall, and this one is all-compassing, it can be justified that somehow non-competitive arrangement is in the best interest of the public. Again, can be something related to community building, corporate social responsibility, something that gives greater benefit to the society, and something that can be justified that I guess economic or social welfare perspective. Now, great caution should be exercised when answering questions from prospective sellers after you send out your RFP or some other document. The problem is that providing additional information to sellers may give them an unfair advantage, because this seller will have his or her question answered while everybody else will not have access to this information. Now, there are a number of ways to address this problem. One way to handle this problem of unfair access to information from the buyer is to appoint a buyer to be in charge of answering all questions, and not a technical specialist that will give a narrow answer to a particular vendor. So this buyer will be in charge of dispatching all questions, so all questions will come to him or her, and then this buyer will talk to the appropriate technical specialist and respond to the vendor. And then when a question is answered, then a question response, the response to this question should be sent to all sellers. So there should be like some kind of email list or mailing list, and you will say that, well, this is the question that was asked, and we would like to send this information to everybody so that everybody bidding on this project has a fair access to the information in relation to this project. Now, the solicitation process ends with the receipt of proposal from prospective sellers. If the final selection is based on price, then it can be as simple as opening bids on the specified date, opening envelopes with the bids in the presence of public, and then announcing the winner. Now, if the award is not that simple, if it's not just based on price, if it is if the award is to be made based on several factors by a committee, then the source selection phase is entered. So that completes Chapter 10 video presentation.